What if I told you that America didn't always have prisons? That for most of colonial history, if you committed a crime, you might be fined, publicly whipped, or simply kicked out of town, but you wouldn't be locked up for years. The idea of the prison as we know it, the penitentiary where criminals are supposed to reflect and reform, that's a relatively modern invention, and it started with the best intentions. Reformers in the late 1700s genuinely believed they were creating something humane, something enlightened, something that would transform criminals into better people through isolation and reflection. What they actually created was something far darker and more complicated than anyone expected. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore the real history of America's first prisons, not the sanitized version, but the actual story of what happened when well meaning people tried to reinvent punishment. From the first experiments in solitary confinement to the prison labor systems that generate massive profits, from the institutions that became warehouses for the vulnerable to the reformers who eventually pushed back. So get comfortable, maybe grab a pillow, and if you find this interesting, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss more history that's stranger and darker than you ever learned in school. Let's start at the beginning, back when prisons weren't even really a thing yet, before prisons existed. So here's something you probably never think about when you're drifting off to sleep. America didn't always have prisons, not in the way we understand them today anyway. And honestly, that's kind of wild when you stop and consider it. We're so used to the idea of prisons being the default answer to crime that it feels almost unnatural to imagine a world without them. But for most of colonial American history, locking someone up for years as punishment simply wasn't part of the plan. If you committed a crime in, say, 1650 or 1700, the colonial authorities had a whole different toolkit to work with. And by toolkit, I mean a collection of options that ranged from mildly inconvenient to absolutely humiliating. You might get fined, which was honestly the best case scenario if you had the money to pay. If you didn't have money, well, that's where things got creative in ways you probably wouldn't enjoy. Public punishment was huge, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. The town square wasn't just for farmers markets and Sunday gatherings, it was prime real estate for public shaming. Stocks and pillories were everywhere. Those wooden contraptions you've probably seen in old paintings where someone's head and hands are locked in place while townsfolk walk by and, let's be honest, probably threw things. Rotten vegetables were popular. So was public opinion, which in a small colonial town could ruin your reputation faster than anything we deal with today. Imagine everyone you've ever known watching you stuck in a wooden frame for hours while they discuss your poor life choices. No thank you. Whipping was common too. It was quick, it was public, and it sent a message. The idea wasn't just to punish the person who broke the law, but to make sure everyone else got the memo that maybe they shouldn't try the same thing. It was deterrence by spectacle, and colonial authorities were really into spectacle. They'd announce punishment days in advance, and people would gather like it was some kind of community event. Because in a way, it was. Justice wasn't something that happened behind closed doors, it happened in front of everyone, and everyone was expected to witness it. Then there was banishment, which honestly sounds kind of appealing until you remember that being kicked out of your community in the 16 or 1700s meant you were on your own in a world that was significantly less friendly than your local Walmart parking lot. No support system, no familiar faces, and depending on where you were, possibly a lot of wilderness that didn't care about your problems. Banishment was reserved for more serious offenses or for people the community just didn't want around anymore. It was the colonial equivalent of being told you're not welcome at Thanksgiving anymore, except permanent and with actual survival stakes. Here's the thing though, jails did exist, but they weren't what you think. Colonial jails were holding cells, basically. If you committed a crime, you might get tossed in jail while the authorities figured out what to do with you. You'd wait there until your trial or until your actual punishment, which, again, was probably going to be a fine or a date with a town square. Jails weren't designed to hold people for months or years. They were temporary, they were dirty, overcrowded, and completely lacking in anything resembling comfort or reform. You weren't there to think about what you'd done. You were there to wait. And that's a critical distinction. The idea of locking someone up for a long time as the punishment itself, that wasn't really on the table. It didn't make practical sense. Colonies were small, resources were limited, and keeping someone fed and housed for years on end was expensive. Why would you do that when you could find them, humiliate them publicly, or just send them away? The whole point was efficiency. Get the punishment over with, make it visible, and move on. There were exceptions, of course. Some people were held longer, especially if they were waiting for a serious trial or if they couldn't pay their debts. Debtors' jails were a thing, and they were as miserable as they sound. You owed money, you couldn't pay, so they locked you up, which obviously didn't help you earn money to pay off the debt. It was a system that made no sense, but it persisted for a really long time anyway because apparently logic took a backseat to tradition. The broader philosophy here was pretty straightforward. Crime was a public matter. It disrupted the community, so the community dealt with it in a public way. The idea that punishment should happen behind closed doors, in a separate institution designed specifically for long-term confinement, just wasn't part of the cultural playbook yet. That would come later, and when it did, it would represent a pretty massive shift in how Americans thought about crime, punishment, and what it meant to reform a person. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, picture colonial America as a place where justice was fast, visible, and often brutal in its simplicity. No prison sentences, no parole boards, no rehabilitation programs, just fines, public humiliation, physical punishment, and the occasional one-way ticket out of town. It was a system built for small communities where everyone knew everyone, and privacy wasn't really a concern because privacy wasn't really a thing. And honestly, it worked for them, at least in the sense that it matched their resources and their mindset. But as America grew, as cities got bigger and populations swelled and crime became more complex, the old methods started to feel inadequate. You can't exactly banish someone from a city of 50,000 people. The town square loses its impact when half the crowd doesn't know who you are, and fines only work if people have money, which a lot of people didn't. So eventually, early Americans started asking a question that would change everything. What if instead of just punishing criminals in public and moving on, we created a separate space where we could hold them, reform them, and maybe even turn them into better people? What if we built something designed specifically for long-term confinement, a place where punishment and reflection could happen together, away from the public eye? It was a radical idea, it was ambitious, and as you're about to hear, it was also the beginning of something much darker than anyone expected. Because once America decided to build prisons, it didn't just create buildings. It created a whole new philosophy about crime, punishment, and what happens when you isolate human beings in the name of making them better. And that philosophy would shape the country for centuries in ways that are still unfolding today. The shift didn't happen overnight, of course. It took decades for the idea to really take hold. But by the late 1700s, the pieces were falling into place. The Enlightenment was influencing how people thought about human nature and rehabilitation. Reformers were starting to believe that criminals weren't just bad people who needed to be punished, but broken people who could be fixed. And if you could fix them, well, didn't society have a moral obligation to try? It sounds noble when you put it that way, and maybe it was, at least in intention, but intentions and outcomes are two very different things. And the outcomes of America's first prison experiments would prove to be far more complicated, far more troubling, and far more influential than anyone could have predicted. But let's take that step by step because before we get to where prisons went wrong, we need to understand how they started in the first place. America's first true prison experiment. All right, so we've established that colonial America wasn't really into long term incarceration. But by the late 1700s, things were starting to change. The country was growing, cities were expanding, crime was becoming more complicated, and slowly the old methods of public punishment and banishment were starting to feel like they weren't cutting it anymore. People were looking for something new, something that felt more civilized, more enlightened. And that's when Philadelphia decided to try something that had never really been done before in America, a real, actual prison designed not just to hold people, but to change them. Enter the Walnut Street Jail. It opened in 1773, but it didn't become the experiment we're talking about until the 1790s, when a group of reformers decided to completely reimagine what it could be. These weren't cruel people, by the way. They were Quakers mostly, and they genuinely believed they were doing something humane. They looked at the old system of public whipping and humiliation and thought, there has to be a better way. And their better way was isolation. The idea was simple, at least on paper. Take a person who had committed a crime, separate them from the corrupting influences of society, give them time alone to reflect on their actions, and maybe throw in some manual labor to teach discipline. In theory, this would lead to repentance, which is where the word penitentiary comes from. The prisoner would become penitent, they'd think about what they'd done, feel genuinely sorry, and emerge as a reformed person, ready to rejoin society as a productive member. It sounded pretty good, especially compared to getting whipped in a town square. So the Walnut Street Jail became the testing ground. Reformers designed a system where prisoners were placed in solitary confinement for significant portions of their sentence. Not as punishment, they insisted, but as rehabilitation. The idea was that solitude would force prisoners to confront their own conscience without distractions. No other inmates to corrupt them, no noise, no chaos, just silence, reflection, and presumably a lot of moral awakening. They also introduced labor as part of the process. Prisoners were given tasks like shoemaking, weaving, and other manual work. The labor was meant to instill discipline and teach useful skills, but it also served another purpose. It kept prisoners busy, idle hands and all that, and honestly, it probably helped offset the cost of running the facility, though that wasn't the stated goal. The stated goal was reform. Always reform. At first, people thought it was working. Visitors came from all over to see this new model of incarceration. Reports went out claiming that the system was a success, that prisoners were indeed becoming more penitent, more reflective, more reformed. It was hailed as a breakthrough in humane punishment. Finally, America had figured out a way to deal with criminals that didn't involve public spectacle or physical violence. This was progress. This was enlightenment, except it wasn't. Not really. Because here's the thing about prolonged isolation. It breaks people. Human beings are social creatures. We're wired for connection, for interaction, for noise and movement, and the presence of others. Take that away for days, weeks, months, and things start to go wrong inside your head. And they did. Prisoners at Walnut Street began showing signs of severe mental distress. Some talked to themselves, some stopped talking altogether. Some developed what we'd now recognize as serious psychological breakdowns. But at the time, this wasn't something reformers wanted to acknowledge publicly. The system was supposed to be working. It was supposed to be humane. Admitting that it was driving people to mental collapse would have undermined the entire experiment. So they didn't admit it, at least not loudly. Instead, they doubled down. If prisoners were struggling, maybe they needed more time to reflect. Maybe they needed stricter silence. Maybe the problem wasn't the system, but the prisoners themselves. This kind of logic would become a pattern in the history of American prisons. When the system doesn't work, blame the people in it, not the design. The Walnut Street Jail kept operating under this model for years. It became a symbol of what a modern prison could be. Other states started paying attention, other reformers started visiting, and slowly the idea that long term isolation could reform criminals began to spread. Not because it worked, necessarily, but because it felt like progress. It felt more civilized than whipping someone in public. It felt like America was moving forward, but the cracks were already showing. And those cracks would only get wider as the prison experiment expanded. The reformers at Walnut Street had created something new, something that looked good on paper and sounded even better in speeches. But in practice, in the dim cells where prisoners spent hour after hour alone with nothing but stone walls and their own thoughts, the reality was far grimmer than anyone wanted to admit. The thing is, the reformers genuinely believed in what they were doing. They saw themselves as progressive, as enlightened, as moving away from the barbarism of public punishment toward something more rational and humane. And in some ways, they were right. Locking someone in a cell was less visibly violent than whipping them in a public square. But violence doesn't always leave visible marks. Sometimes it happens quietly, in the slow erosion of a person's mental health, in the way isolation chips away at someone's sense of self until there's almost nothing left. And that's what was happening at Walnut Street. Even as visitors praised the facility and reformers congratulated themselves on creating something revolutionary, the prisoners themselves, the ones actually experiencing the system, were telling a different story. But their voices didn't carry the same weight as the reformers' reports. They were criminals, after all. Why would anyone listen to them? This disconnect between the official narrative and the lived reality would define American prisons for generations. The system looked good from the outside, sounded reasonable in theory, and satisfied the public's desire for a more civilized approach to punishment. But for the people actually locked inside, the experience was something else entirely. Something darker. Something that would leave scars long after they were released, if they were released at all. And that brings us to the next phase of this story, where the ideas tested at Walnut Street got bigger, got more extreme, and got exported across the entire country. Because if you thought solitary confinement for a part of a sentence was intense, wait until you hear about the prisons that made isolation the entire point. But we'll get there. For now, just remember that the road to America's prison system was paved with good intentions, reform-minded Quakers, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what happens when you leave a human being alone with nothing but their thoughts for too long. The rise of the penitentiary. So now we need to talk about a word that probably sounds kind of old-fashioned and vaguely religious, and that's because it is both of those things. The word is penitentiary. And if you've ever wondered why we call some prisons penitentiaries, well, buckle up, because the answer is simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. The word comes from penitent, which means someone who's sorry for what they've done, someone who's repenting. And that right there tells you everything about what early prison reformers were trying to accomplish. They didn't just want to punish criminals. They wanted to transform them. They wanted to take someone who had broken the law and, through careful intervention and the right environment, turn them into someone who genuinely regretted their actions and wanted to live a better life. It's actually kind of beautiful when you think about it, at least in theory. The idea that people could change, that criminals weren't just irredeemably bad, but were capable of moral growth and redemption, was pretty progressive for the late 1700s and early 1800s. It suggested that society had a responsibility not just to punish wrongdoers, but to help them become better people. And the tool they chose for this transformation was isolation. Here's how the logic worked, at least in the minds of the reformers. They believed that crime was caused by bad influences, other criminals, corrupt environments, vice, temptation, all the things that existed in the messy, chaotic world outside. So, if you wanted to reform a criminal, you needed to remove them from all of those influences. You needed to create a controlled environment where they couldn't be corrupted by others, where they couldn't fall back into old habits, where they had nothing to do but sit and think about their life choices. And what better environment for that than a cell? A quiet, isolated space where a prisoner could be alone with their thoughts, their conscience, and ideally, a Bible. Because religion played a huge role in this philosophy. The reformers believed that moral reflection naturally led to religious awakening, and religious awakening led to genuine repentance. It was all connected. Give someone enough time alone to think, and they'd eventually come to see the error of their ways. They'd become penitent, hence penitentiary. Now, if this is starting to sound a little naive, that's because it was. But you have to understand the context. These reformers were reacting against a system that felt brutal and dehumanizing. Public whippings, brandings, executions. These were the norms they were trying to move away from. So the idea of a quiet cell where someone could reflect and change seemed not just humane, but revolutionary. It was the Enlightenment applied to criminal justice. Reason, introspection, moral improvement. It all sounded so civilized. The problem, and this is a big problem, is that the reformers were basing their entire philosophy on assumptions about human nature that weren't actually tested. They believed isolation would lead to reflection. They believed reflection would lead to repentance. They believed repentance would lead to lasting change. But they didn't really know if any of that was true because they'd never actually tried it on a large scale before. They were conducting an experiment on human beings, using a theory that sounded good but had no real evidence behind it. And here's where things get even more complicated. The penitentiary model wasn't just about changing individuals, it was also about changing society's relationship with punishment. In the old system, punishment was public, immediate, and physical. Everyone could see it. Everyone could participate in it, even if just as witnesses. But the penitentiary moved punishment behind walls. It made it private, long-term, and psychological. And that shift fundamentally changed how people thought about crime and justice. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. Once criminals were locked away in penitentiaries, the public didn't have to think about them as much. They didn't have to witness their punishment. They could just trust that the system was working, that the reformers knew what they were doing, that somewhere behind those stone walls, real transformation was happening. It was convenient, it was clean, and it allowed society to feel good about itself without actually confronting the messy reality of what was happening inside those institutions, because the reality was messy, really messy. Isolation doesn't automatically lead to moral reflection. Sometimes it just leads to despair, confusion, mental breakdown, and a desperate need for any kind of human contact. But the reformers had invested so much in this philosophy, had built so much of their identity around being progressive and humane, that acknowledging these problems would have meant admitting their entire approach was flawed. And that's a hard thing to do when you've convinced yourself you're saving people. So instead, they adjusted. If prisoners weren't becoming penitent quickly enough, maybe they needed more isolation. If they were showing signs of mental distress, maybe that was just part of the process, a necessary breaking down before the building back up. If the system wasn't working as intended, maybe the problem was the prisoners, not the system. This kind of circular reasoning became standard practice. The philosophy was sound, they insisted. It was the application that needed tweaking, and tweak they did. The penitentiary model spread from Pennsylvania to other states, each one putting its own spin on how to implement isolation and silence and moral reform. Some went even further than the original Walnut Street Jail, creating systems of total isolation that made the first experiment look almost gentle by comparison. Others tried to find a middle ground, combining isolation with labor, silence with structure. But they all shared the same core belief that separating criminals from society and from each other was the key to reform. This philosophy would dominate American prison design for decades. It would influence architecture, policy, daily routines, everything. The very shape of prisons, with their cell blocks and individual cells radiating out from a central point, was designed to maximize isolation and surveillance. Guards could watch prisoners, but prisoners couldn't see or communicate with each other. It was control masquerading as care, and it became the blueprint for incarceration across the entire country. But here's the thing that's important to understand as we move forward. The penitentiary wasn't just a building. It was an idea about what punishment should look like, what reform should feel like, and what society owed to people who broke its laws. And that idea, despite its flaws, despite the evidence that was already mounting against it, took hold in American culture so deeply that we're still grappling with it today. We still call some prisons penitentiaries. We still talk about rehabilitation and reform. We still act like isolation is a necessary part of punishment. The early reformers thought they were creating something humane, something enlightened, something that would prove America was more civilized than the brutal systems of the past. And maybe in some ways they were moving in a better direction. But they were also creating something else. A system that would grow far beyond their control. That would be used in ways they never intended. And that would cause suffering on a scale they couldn't have imagined. The penitentiary was supposed to save people. But as you're about to hear, it often did the exact opposite. And nowhere was that more evident than in the prison that took the isolation philosophy to its absolute extreme. The Pennsylvania system. All right, so if you thought the Walnut Street Jail's approach to isolation was intense, let me introduce you to the Pennsylvania system, which basically looked at the idea of solitary confinement and said, you know what? Let's make that the entire experience. No half measures, no compromises, just pure, uninterrupted isolation from the moment a prisoner arrived until the moment they left. And the crown jewel of this system was a place called Eastern State Penitentiary. Eastern State opened in 1829 in Philadelphia, and it was unlike anything that had come before. The building itself was designed to be imposing. Massive stone walls, fortress-like architecture, and a layout that looked almost like a wheel, with cell blocks radiating out from a central hub. It was built to inspire fear and awe in equal measure. But the real innovation wasn't the architecture, it was what happened inside. Under the Pennsylvania system, prisoners were kept in complete isolation, and I mean complete. From the moment they entered Eastern State, they were separated from every other prisoner. They lived alone in individual cells. They worked alone. They exercised alone in small individual yards attached to their cells. They ate alone. They slept alone. And most importantly, they were not allowed to speak to or even see other prisoners. The reformers behind this system believed they were perfecting the penitentiary concept. If isolation for part of the day was good, then isolation all day, every day, must be even better. The idea was that constant solitude would force prisoners into such deep moral reflection that they'd have no choice but to confront their sins, repent, and emerge as completely reformed individuals. It was the logical extreme of everything the early prison reformers believed about human nature and redemption. But here's where things got even more extreme. When prisoners needed to be moved from one part of the facility to another, guards would place hoods over their heads, actual fabric hoods that completely covered their faces. This wasn't done to humiliate them, although it certainly had that effect. It was done to ensure they couldn't see other prisoners or the layout of the prison. The isolation had to be total, you see. Even a glimpse of another human being might corrupt the moral reflection process. Think about that for a second. Imagine being locked in a cell by yourself for 23 hours a day, and then when you're finally moved somewhere, they put a hood over your head so you can't even see where you're going. It's the kind of thing that sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud, but it was official policy. It was part of the system. And the people running Eastern State genuinely believed this was humane, that they were helping these prisoners become better people. The cells themselves were designed with care, which somehow makes the whole thing even more unsettling. They weren't tiny dungeon cells. They were actually reasonably sized, with high ceilings and a small skylight that let in natural light. Each cell had a flush toilet, which was actually pretty advanced for the time. Prisoners were given work to do in their cells, tasks like weaving or shoemaking that would keep them occupied. On paper, the conditions weren't terrible, but paper doesn't account for what happens to a human mind when it's deprived of social contact for months or years at a time. And things did happen. Prisoners started showing disturbing signs of psychological distress. Some talked to themselves constantly. Some created imaginary companions just to have someone to interact with. Others stopped talking altogether, retreating so far into themselves that even when they were eventually released, they struggled to communicate normally. Some prisoners were found talking to the walls, having full conversations with stone and mortar, because that was the only interaction available to them. Visitors to Eastern State started noticing these issues almost immediately. One of the most famous critics was Charles Dickens, the British novelist, who visited in 1842. He was horrified by what he saw. Dickens wrote about prisoners who seemed broken, who stared blankly, who had clearly been damaged by their isolation in ways that had nothing to do with moral improvement. He called the Pennsylvania system cruel and wrong, and he didn't mince words about it. This wasn't reform, he argued. This was torture dressed up in the language of progress. But here's the frustrating part. The officials running Eastern State didn't agree. They insisted the system was working. They pointed to prisoners who claimed to have found God during their isolation. They emphasized the absence of physical violence. They argued that any mental distress was temporary, a necessary part of the moral transformation process. And when critics like Dickens raised concerns, they were dismissed as outsiders who didn't understand the deeper philosophy at work. This kind of denial became a pattern. As more evidence mounted that the Pennsylvania system was causing serious psychological harm, the people invested in it kept finding ways to explain it away. If prisoners went mad, well, maybe they were already mentally unstable. If they struggled to reintegrate into society after release, maybe they hadn't been isolated long enough. The system itself was never the problem. It was always something else. Eastern State operated under this model for decades. Other prisons tried to copy it, though most eventually gave up because, among other things, it was incredibly expensive. Keeping prisoners in complete isolation required more space, more staff, more resources than other models. But even as the practical problems became clear, the philosophy persisted. The idea that isolation could reform people, that removing all social contact was somehow therapeutic, remained deeply embedded in American thinking about prisons. And here's something that should make you uncomfortable. We never really moved away from this. Solitary confinement is still used in American prisons today. Oh, sure, we don't call it the Pennsylvania system anymore. and we don't put hoods on prisoners' heads when we move them. But the core practice of isolating prisoners for long periods, often 23 hours a day or more, is still happening. We have more evidence than ever that it causes serious psychological harm, that it doesn't improve behavior, that it violates basic human dignity. But we keep doing it anyway. Eastern State eventually abandoned the pure isolation model in the mid-1800s. It was too expensive, too difficult to maintain, and too obviously damaging to the prisoners subjected to it. But the building itself remained a prison for over a century, finally closing in 1971. Today it's a museum, a historic site where you can walk through those old cell blocks and see the small skylights and the individual exercise yards, and try to imagine what it must have been like to live there, alone, for years. The Pennsylvania system was supposed to represent the pinnacle of enlightened punishment. It was supposed to show the world that America had figured out how to reform criminals through isolation and moral reflection. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about what happens when we let philosophy override human compassion, when we build systems based on untested theories and then refuse to acknowledge when those theories prove disastrously wrong. But the Pennsylvania system wasn't the only model being tried during this period. Up in New York, a different approach was taking shape. One that would ultimately win out not because it was more humane, but because it was cheaper and more efficient. And that's where our story goes next, to a place where silence was still enforced, but prisoners were at least allowed to see each other, even if they could never speak. Though as you'll hear, that came with its own set of very dark complications. The Auburn system. So while Pennsylvania was experimenting with total isolation, at Eastern State Penitentiary, New York was developing its own approach to prison reform. And, honestly, if you had to choose between the two systems, the New York model probably sounds better at first. It was called the Auburn system, named after Auburn Prison, which opened in 1816. And unlike the Pennsylvania system, it didn't keep prisoners locked in solitary cells around the clock. Prisoners were allowed to see each other. They worked together. They ate together. Progress, right? Well, not exactly. Because here's the catch. While prisoners in the Auburn system could see each other, they absolutely could not speak to each other. Not a word, not a whisper, not even a glance that lasted too long. The entire system was built around enforced silence. Prisoners worked side by side in workshops during the day, but they did so in complete silence. They ate their meals together in the dining hall, but they did so without speaking. And at night, they were returned to individual cells where they slept alone. The philosophy behind this was kind of a compromise between the old public punishment model and the Pennsylvania isolation model. Reformers in New York agreed that prisoners needed to be separated from corrupting influences, but they thought total isolation was too extreme and, let's be honest, too expensive. So instead, they created a system where prisoners could be together physically, but isolated socially. You could work next to someone for years and never exchange a single word with them. You were alone in a crowd, which in some ways might be even more maddening than being alone in a cell. Auburn Prison itself was designed to facilitate this system. The cell blocks were arranged in tiers with small individual cells stacked on top of each other. The cells were tiny, barely big enough for a cot and maybe a bucket. They weren't meant for living. They were meant for sleeping. The real action happened during the day in the workshops, where prisoners manufactured goods that the prison could sell. This is important, and we'll come back to it, but basically the Auburn system was designed to be productive in a way the Pennsylvania system wasn't. Prisoners weren't just reflecting on their sins. They were making money for the state. The silence rule was enforced strictly. And I mean strictly. Guards monitored prisoners constantly, watching for any sign of communication. If you were caught talking or even making eye contact for too long, there were consequences. Physical discipline was used to maintain order. We're talking about a system where silence wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory, and breaking that rule meant punishment. The exact nature of that punishment varied, but it was enough to make prisoners think twice about trying to communicate. Now, the reformers who designed the Auburn system argued that this was more humane than the Pennsylvania approach. Prisoners weren't going insane from total isolation. They were learning discipline through work. They were being trained in useful trades. And they were doing all of this in a system that was significantly cheaper to operate than Eastern State's one prisoner per cell model. From a practical standpoint, Auburn made more sense. You could house more prisoners, employ them productively, and still maintain the moral reform aspect through enforced silence and strict routine. But here's what they didn't talk about as much: the psychological toll of enforced silence. Imagine working next to someone every day, sharing space with dozens of other human beings, and not being allowed to acknowledge their existence verbally. No jokes to break the monotony, no words of encouragement, no casual conversation to make the day go faster. Just silence, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. It's a special kind of isolation, one that's arguably worse in some ways than being completely alone because you're constantly reminded of what you're missing. Prisoners found ways to communicate anyway, of course. They developed hand signals, subtle gestures, ways of passing notes or leaving messages. Guards cracked down on these methods whenever they discovered them, but prisoners kept finding new ones. Because humans need to communicate. It's fundamental to who we are. And when you try to strip that away, people will find workarounds no matter how strict the enforcement. The work component of the Auburn system was presented as rehabilitative, as teaching prisoners valuable skills they could use when they were released. And maybe for some prisoners, that was true. But let's be real about what was actually happening here. Prisoners were being used as labor. They were manufacturing goods that generated revenue for the state. The workshops at Auburn and other prisons using this system produced everything from furniture to barrels to tools. And the prisoners doing this work weren't being paid, or if they were, it was a pittance. The reform rhetoric was nice, but the economic incentive was hard to ignore. This is where the Auburn system starts to look less like a humanitarian improvement and more like a pragmatic business decision. You get discipline through silence, you get productivity through labor, and you get profit through the goods manufactured. It's efficient. It's self-sustaining. And it doesn't require the expensive infrastructure of individual cells and exercise yards that the Pennsylvania system demanded. From a state budget perspective, Auburn was the clear winner. The daily routine at Auburn Prison was rigid and unchanging. Prisoners woke at the same time every day. They marched to the workshops in lockstep, literally synchronized in their movements. They worked for hours in silence. They ate their meals facing the same direction, often with barriers between them to prevent even visual contact. They marched back to their cells at night. And then they did it all again the next day. And the next. And the next. The sameness was part of the design. Routine was supposed to instill discipline. Predictability was supposed to eliminate chaos. But it also eliminated any sense of autonomy or individuality. Guards in the Auburn system had tremendous power. They were the enforcers of silence, the maintainers of order, the ones who decided when a prisoner had broken the rules and what the consequences would be. And as with any system that gives a small group of people absolute power over another group, there were problems. Not all guards were cruel, but the system itself created conditions where cruelty could flourish. When you're not allowed to speak, when your every movement is controlled, when you exist in a state of constant surveillance and potential punishment, the power dynamic becomes deeply unbalanced. Visitors to Auburn Prison, like visitors to Eastern State, had mixed reactions. Some praised the order and discipline they saw. Look how quiet it is, they'd say. Look how productive. This is what reform looks like. Others were disturbed by the mechanical nature of it all, by the way prisoners moved like automatons, by the absence of anything resembling human interaction or warmth. But as with the Pennsylvania system, the people running Auburn dismissed the critics. The system works, they insisted. Look at the numbers, look at the productivity, look at how cheaply we can operate. And that last point, the cheapness, is really what made the Auburn system successful in the long run. Because as more states looked at building their own prisons, they had to make a choice. Do we follow Pennsylvania's expensive model of total isolation, or do we follow New York's cheaper model of congregate labor with enforced silence? And in most cases, the decision came down to money. Auburn was simply more affordable. You could build bigger prisons, house more prisoners, and even turn a profit through prison labor. The humanitarian arguments mattered less than the economic ones. This set a precedent that would echo through American prison history. Over and over again, decisions about how to run prisons would be made based on cost and efficiency rather than what was actually best for the prisoners or for society. The Auburn system proved you could make incarceration pay for itself. You could even make it profitable. And once that became clear, the trajectory of American prisons was essentially locked in. Reform rhetoric would continue, but the underlying reality would always come back to economics. The Auburn system also normalized something that seems almost quaint now, but was radical at the time. The idea that prisoners could and should work for the benefit of the institution holding them. Before Auburn, prison labor existed, but wasn't systematized. After Auburn, it became standard practice. Prisons weren't just places of punishment or reform. They were workshops, factories, sources of cheap or free labor that could be exploited for profit. And that shift would have consequences that we're still dealing with today. So that's the Auburn system. Not as extreme as Pennsylvania in its isolation, but extreme in its own way. A system that let prisoners be near each other while ensuring they remained fundamentally alone, that used silence as a form of control, and that turned incarceration into a profitable enterprise. It wasn't humane. It wasn't really about reform, but it was efficient, and in America, efficiency often wins. Which system won all right? So we've got two competing models of prison reform happening in America during the early 1800s. On one side, Pennsylvania with its total isolation approach at Eastern State Penitentiary. On the other side, New York with its congregate labor and enforced silence model at Auburn Prison. Both claim to be humane. Both claim to be effective. Both attracted visitors from around the world who wanted to see these innovative American approaches to criminal justice. So, which one won? If you guessed Auburn, you'd be right. But probably not for the reasons the reformers wanted. The Pennsylvania system, for all its philosophical appeal, had a fatal flaw. It was incredibly expensive. Building a prison where every single prisoner gets their own cell with a small exercise yard, a skylight, and a flush toilet costs a lot of money. Staffing a facility where prisoners need to be constantly isolated from each other takes a lot of guards. Maintaining that level of separation for years at a time requires significant resources. And while some states tried to replicate the Pennsylvania model, most quickly realized they couldn't afford it. The Auburn system, on the other hand, was cheap, relatively speaking anyway. The cells were tiny, basically just spaces to sleep. You could stack them in tiers, pack them tightly together, and house way more prisoners in the same amount of space. During the day, prisoners worked together in large workshops, which meant you needed fewer guards to supervise them. And crucially, those workshops produced goods that could be sold, generating revenue that helped offset the cost of running the prison. It was, in the language of government bureaucrats everywhere, cost effective. So, as more states built prisons in the mid to late 1800s, they almost universally chose the Auburn model, not because it was better for prisoners, not because it produced better outcomes, but because it was cheaper and more efficient. The humanitarian arguments that had launched the whole prison reform movement in the first place took a back seat to practical economics. And honestly, that's a pattern you'll see over and over in the history of American incarceration. The noble ideals get announced publicly, but the actual decisions get made based on budgets and bottom lines. There's something deeply cynical about this, but also kind of predictable. State legislatures had to balance a lot of competing priorities: building schools, maintaining roads, paying government salaries. All of that cost money. So when prison administrators came to them and said, "We can house criminals, keep them disciplined, teach them trades, and even turn a profit using the Auburn system," versus "We need massive funding to keep criminals in isolated cells where they'll just sit and think all day," the choice was obvious. Auburn won because it made financial sense, but the victory of the Auburn system meant something else too. It meant that the original goals of prison reform, the whole penitentiary philosophy about moral reflection and redemption, were being replaced by a focus on control and productivity. Silence wasn't enforced because it led to moral awakening. It was enforced because it made prisoners easier to manage. Labor wasn't provided to teach skills, it was provided to generate revenue. The language of reform remained, but the reality was increasingly about efficiency and profit. This spread across the country remarkably quickly. By the mid 1800s, most new state prisons were following the Auburn model or some variation of it. Michigan, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Ohio, they all built prisons with the same basic structure: small individual cells for sleeping, large workshops for labor, strict rules about silence and discipline. The architectural footprint of these institutions became standardized. If you've ever seen pictures of old 19th century prisons, they tend to look similar because they were all copying the same basic template. The Pennsylvania system didn't disappear completely. Eastern State continued operating under its isolation model for a while, though even it eventually had to modify its approach due to overcrowding and cost. A few other institutions tried to maintain elements of the Pennsylvania philosophy, but they were the exceptions. Auburn had won the national conversation about how prisons should work. International observers noticed this too. European countries sent delegations to America to study both systems and decide which one to adopt for their own prison reforms. The debates were heated. French sociologists Gustave de Beaumont and Alexis de Tocqueville came to America specifically to study the prison systems and wrote extensively about their findings. They saw merit in both approaches, but also recognized the practical advantages of Auburn. Other countries ultimately made their own choices, but the Auburn model's influence spread far beyond America's borders. What's interesting is that the people running Auburn-style prisons kept using the language of the Pennsylvania reformers. They still talked about penitence and moral improvement. They still insisted that their system was humane and rehabilitative. But if you looked at what was actually happening, the priorities had clearly shifted. The workshops were producing thousands of dollars worth of goods annually. The silence rules were enforced through physical discipline. The entire structure was designed for control and efficiency first, with reform as maybe a distant secondary goal. And prisoners knew the difference. They experienced the reality behind the rhetoric every day. They understood that they were being used as labor, that their work was making money for the state, that the whole setup had more to do with economics than with helping them become better people. But their voices didn't carry much weight in the public debate. They were criminals, after all. Why would society listen to their perspective on whether the system was actually working? This is where the Auburn system's victory becomes really significant historically. It established a template for American prisons that would persist for generations. The focus on labor and profit, the emphasis on control and efficiency, the gap between reform rhetoric and operational reality, all of these became standard features of American incarceration. States would tinker with the details, introduce new programs or policies, build more modern facilities. But the fundamental structure established by Auburn remained largely intact. The irony is that the Auburn system didn't even achieve its stated goals particularly well. Recidivism rates remained high. Prisoners released from Auburn and similar institutions often struggled to reintegrate into society. The trades they'd learned in prison workshops didn't always translate to employable skills on the outside. And the psychological effects of years spent in enforced silence, while maybe less severe than total isolation, were still significant. But none of that mattered as much as the fact that the system was cheap and self-sustaining. There's a lesson in this, though it's not a particularly comforting one. When it comes to large-scale social institutions like prisons, the systems that succeed aren't necessarily the ones that work best. They're the ones that cost least and create the fewest political problems. Auburn succeeded because it gave politicians and prison administrators what they wanted: a way to deal with criminals that looked humane, didn't require huge ongoing investments, and even generated some revenue. Whether it actually reformed anyone was almost beside the point. So the Auburn system won. It became the dominant model for American prisons throughout the 1800s and into the 20th century. Its influence can still be seen in prison design and operations today. And that victory, that choice to prioritize efficiency over effectiveness, shaped the trajectory of American criminal justice in ways we're still grappling with. Because once you establish that prisons can be profitable, once you prove that you can run them cheaply by using prisoner labor, it becomes really hard to move away from that model, even when you know it's not actually helping anyone. And speaking of prison labor and profit, that's where our story goes next. Because the Auburn system didn't just win the philosophical debate about how prisons should operate. It opened the door to something much larger and more troubling: the transformation of American prisons into economic enterprises, where the labor of incarcerated people became a valuable commodity. But we'll get into that, and trust me, it gets darker from here. Prison labor and profit. So here's where things get really uncomfortable, and I mean that in a way that should probably keep you up at night, even though this is supposed to be putting you to sleep. We need to talk about prison labor. Not just the idea that prisoners worked, because as we've already discussed, labor was built into both the Pennsylvania and Auburn systems from the beginning. No, we need to talk about what happened when states and private businesses realized that prison labor could be genuinely profitable, like serious money profitable. Remember how the Auburn system won partly because it was cheaper to operate? Well, it wasn't just cheaper. It could actually generate revenue. Prisoners in Auburn-style institutions worked in large workshops, producing goods that could be sold on the open market. Furniture, shoes, barrels, tools, textiles, all sorts of manufactured products. And the beautiful thing, from an economic standpoint anyway, was that the labor costs were essentially zero. Prisoners weren't paid, or if they were, it was maybe a few cents a day. No unions, no strikes, no complaints about working conditions that anyone in power cared about. It was, in the most cynical sense possible, a perfect labor force. By the mid-1800s, prison labor had become a significant part of many states' economies. Workshops inside prisons were producing goods that competed directly with products made by free workers outside. And this created tension, because free workers and their employers weren't exactly thrilled about competing with prison-made goods that cost a fraction to produce. But states needed the revenue, so they kept the system going. sometimes contracting with private companies who would pay to use prison labor for their own manufacturing needs. Let's pause on that for a second. Private companies paying to use prisoners as workers. The state would essentially lease out its incarcerated population to businesses who needed cheap labor. The companies got workers who couldn't quit, couldn't demand better pay, and couldn't organize. The state got money that helped fund the prison system and maybe even generated a profit. And the prisoners? Well, they got to work long hours for little to no compensation, learning trades that may or may not help them after release, all while being told this was for their own moral improvement. The contract labor system, as it was called, became incredibly common. A company would negotiate a contract with a prison to use a certain number of prisoners for a specific type of work. Sometimes the work happened inside the prison. Other times, prisoners were actually transported to work sites outside the prison walls, though always under guard. The companies paid the state used that money to fund prison operations, and everyone except the prisoners came out ahead financially. Now, the reformers and prison administrators insisted that this was still about rehabilitation. Prisoners were learning skills, after all. They were developing work discipline. They were being productive members of society, even if that society was behind bars. And sure, there was probably some truth to that for some prisoners. Learning a trade is valuable. Having something to do with your time is better than sitting idle. But let's not kid ourselves about what the primary motivation was here. This was about money, pure and simple. The types of work varied depending on the region and the industries that were prominent there. In the Northeast, prisoners often worked in manufacturing, making goods for the industrial economy. In other areas, they might work in agriculture or mining or construction. The common thread was that the work was hard, the conditions were often poor, and the compensation was minimal. And because prisoners had no real recourse, no way to complain or negotiate, those conditions rarely improved unless outside reformers made enough noise to force changes. Some prisons essentially became factories. The workshops took up more space than the cell blocks. Prisoners would spend 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day working, then return to their tiny cells to sleep before starting all over again the next morning. The routine was exhausting. And the silence rules that were supposed to encourage moral reflection, they also made it really convenient to maintain control over a large workforce. Hard to organize a work stoppage when you're not allowed to talk to your fellow workers. Here's something that should bother you. This system created a perverse incentive structure. The more prisoners a state had, the more labor it could sell. The longer prisoners stayed incarcerated, the more work they could extract from them. So suddenly there was an economic reason to keep prisons full and sentences long. Now, I'm not saying that judges were explicitly told to hand down longer sentences to boost prison labor numbers, but I'm saying that once incarceration becomes tied to economic productivity, the incentives start pointing in some pretty troubling directions. This also meant that prisons had a financial interest in maintaining discipline and preventing escapes, but not necessarily in actual reform. A reformed prisoner who got released early was a lost worker. A prisoner who served their full sentence and maybe even got it extended for behavioral infractions, that was continued productivity. The rhetoric about moral improvement remained, but the economic reality was pushing in a different direction. The goods produced by prison labor were sold all over the country. If you bought furniture or tools or clothing in the mid to late 1800s, there was a decent chance it was made, at least in part, by prisoners. And most people buying these goods had no idea. There wasn't exactly clear labeling. The products just entered the market like anything else, often cheaper than comparable goods made by free workers, which again created tension with outside labor movements. By the 1880s and 1890s, Labor unions were starting to push back hard against prison labor. They argued, quite reasonably, that it undercut wages and working conditions for free workers. How could a private business compete with a prison workshop that paid its workers nothing? The unions lobbied for laws restricting the sale of prison made goods, and some states did eventually pass such restrictions. But the practice continued in various forms because, and I can't stress this enough, it was too profitable to abandon. Some prisons went even further with the profit motive. They would lease out not just prisoners' labor, but entire groups of prisoners to private companies or individuals. This was especially common in the South after the Civil War, but we'll get to that specific context shortly. The point is that prisoners became commodities. They were assets on a balance sheet, and that fundamental transformation from people being punished and supposedly reformed into economic resources to be exploited changed the entire nature of American incarceration. The reformers who started the penitentiary movement would probably have been horrified if they could see what their ideas had become. They genuinely believed in redemption through isolation and reflection. They thought they were creating a humane alternative to brutal public punishment. But what actually emerged was a system that combined elements of factory work, forced labor, and economic exploitation, all wrapped in the language of moral improvement and rehabilitation. And here's the thing that makes this especially frustrating. The labor itself wasn't necessarily bad. Working can be meaningful. Learning a trade can be valuable. Having structure and purpose in your day is genuinely beneficial for mental health. But when the primary goal is profit rather than genuine skill development, when prisoners are worked to exhaustion for minimal or no compensation, when the economic incentives push toward longer sentences and fuller prisons, the whole thing becomes something else entirely. It becomes exploitation masquerading as reform. This pattern would continue and evolve over the following decades. Prison labor never went away. It just changed forms, adapted to new economic realities, found new justifications. Today, prisoners still work in American prisons, often for wages that would be illegal anywhere else. They make products, provide services, even fight wildfires in some states. The scale has changed. The specific industries have shifted, but the basic dynamic established in the 1800s remains. Incarceration as an economic enterprise, reform as rhetoric, profit as reality. So that's the story of how American prisons became businesses. It happened gradually through a series of small decisions and economic pressures until suddenly the whole system was oriented around productivity and profit rather than actual rehabilitation. And once that shift happened, once the financial incentives were baked into the structure, it became nearly impossible to reverse. Because who wants to give up a source of revenue, especially when you can still claim you're helping prisoners by giving them work and teaching them skills? It's the perfect cover for what amounts to a massive exercise in economic exploitation. Who filled early prisons? All right, so we've talked about how early American prisons were designed, what philosophies drove their creation, and how they evolved into profit-generating enterprises. But we haven't really addressed a crucial question. Who actually ended up in these prisons? Because the answer to that question reveals a lot about what these institutions really were and who they really served. The short answer is this. Early American prisons were disproportionately filled with the poor, immigrants, and people dealing with mental illness. Not because these groups committed more crimes necessarily, but because they were the most vulnerable to a legal system that had limited options and little interest in distinguishing between different kinds of social problems. If you were wealthy and got in trouble, you could usually pay your way out through fines or settlements. If you were poor and got in trouble, prison was often the only option. Let's start with poverty because it's foundational to understanding the prison population. In the 1800s, a lot of what got people sent to prison weren't violent crimes or major property offenses. They were things like vagrancy, public drunkenness, petty theft, being unable to pay debts, basically being poor and visible about it. If you had nowhere to live and were found sleeping in public, that was vagrancy. If you stole food because you were hungry, that was theft. If you owed money and couldn't pay, that was a crime in many jurisdictions. Wealthier people who did commit crimes often had options. They could hire lawyers, they could pay fines, they could post bail. They had social connections and family support that could intervene. Poor people had none of that. So when they ended up in the legal system, there was really only one place for them to go: prison. The system claimed to be blind to class, but in practice, it very much wasn't. Immigrants were another major group filling early prisons, especially as immigration to America increased throughout the 1800s. Irish immigrants, German immigrants, later Italian and Eastern European immigrants, they all found themselves overrepresented in prison populations. Part of this was economic. Immigrants often arrived with little money and struggled to find work, which pushed them into exactly the kind of poverty-related crimes I just mentioned. But part of it was also cultural bias and outright discrimination. Many native-born Americans viewed immigrants with suspicion. Different languages, different customs, different religions in some cases. When crime happened, immigrants made convenient scapegoats. They were arrested more readily, prosecuted more harshly, and convicted more frequently than native-born Americans accused of similar offenses. The judicial system reflected the prejudices of the broader society, and those prejudices pointed toward foreign-born individuals as sources of moral corruption and criminal behavior. The Irish faced particularly harsh treatment in many cities during the mid-1800s. They were fleeing famine and poverty in Ireland, arriving in American cities by the tens of thousands, and they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. Irish immigrants were arrested at disproportionate rates, often for minor offenses like drunkenness or disorderly conduct. In some cities, the majority of people in local jails were Irish immigrants. This wasn't because Irish people were inherently more criminal. It was because the system targeted them. Then there were people dealing with mental illness. And this is where things get particularly dark because early American prisons became de facto mental institutions for people who had nowhere else to go. The understanding of mental illness in the 1800s was extremely limited. People experiencing psychosis, severe depression, intellectual disabilities, or other conditions often couldn't function in society without support. And if they didn't have family to care for them, the options were grim. Poorhouses and almshouses existed. Overcrowded institutions where the destitute were warehoused. But as prisons expanded, they increasingly took on the role of housing people with mental illness, especially if those individuals had any contact with the legal system. Someone experiencing a mental health crisis who acted out publicly could easily be arrested and sent to prison, rather than receiving any kind of appropriate care. Once there, they were subjected to the same harsh conditions as everyone else, which obviously didn't help their mental state and often made things much worse. Prisons weren't designed to accommodate people with mental illness. The isolation, the silence rules, the rigid discipline, all of that was traumatic for anyone, but it was especially devastating for people already struggling with psychological issues. Yet prisons kept filling up with mentally ill individuals because there simply wasn't anywhere else to put them. The reform movement that created penitentiaries had promised moral rehabilitation, but what it actually delivered was a dumping ground for society's most vulnerable people. Women were also incarcerated, though in much smaller numbers than men. The crimes women were typically imprisoned for tell their own story. Prostitution, vagrancy, being deemed morally unfit. The standards for female criminality were often tied to gender expectations. A woman who didn't conform to proper Victorian behavior could find herself labeled deviant and locked up, and the conditions for women in early prisons were frequently worse than for men, with less oversight and more opportunities for mistreatment. Children ended up in early prisons too, which is genuinely horrifying to think about. Juvenile justice as a separate system didn't really exist yet. If a child committed a crime or was simply orphaned and got swept up in a vagrancy charge, they could end up in the same institutions as adult offenders. Some prisons tried to separate children from adults, but many didn't. Kids as young as 8 or 10 were subjected to the same isolation, silence, and harsh labor as grown men and women. The racial composition of early prison populations varied by region, but racial bias was present everywhere. In the North, free Black Americans were arrested and incarcerated at rates higher than their population percentage. In the South before the Civil War, enslaved people were generally not sent to prisons because they were already controlled through the institution of slavery. But free Black individuals faced constant scrutiny and were frequently imprisoned for minor infractions. After the Civil War, the situation in the South would change dramatically and become even worse, but we'll get to that. What's important to understand is that early American prisons were never just about crime in the abstract. They were about controlling specific populations: the poor who couldn't pay their way out, immigrants who seemed foreign and threatening, people with mental illness who had nowhere else to go, anyone who didn't fit neatly into the social order or who lacked the resources to navigate the legal system. Prisons became repositories for people society didn't know what to do with or didn't want to see. The reformers who created the penitentiary system imagined they were building institutions that would transform criminals into moral, productive citizens. But what they actually built were warehouses for the vulnerable. Places where poverty, mental illness, immigrant status, and other forms of marginalization converged with a legal system that had neither the tools nor the inclination to distinguish between different kinds of social problems. So everyone got lumped together and subjected to the same regime of isolation, labor, and discipline. This pattern would continue throughout American history. Prison populations have always been disproportionately poor, disproportionately composed of marginalized groups, disproportionately made up of people who lacked access to resources and support. The specific groups have shifted over time as immigration patterns changed and social attitudes evolved, but the underlying dynamic has remained remarkably consistent. Prisons fill up with whoever society wants to hide or control, and then we tell ourselves it's about justice and public safety when it's really about something much more complicated and uncomfortable. The Southern exception. So we need to talk about what happened in the South after the Civil War. And I'm going to be very careful here because this is a topic where the facts are disturbing enough without any exaggeration. What emerged in the Southern states following the end of slavery in 1865 was a prison system that looked very different from what was happening in the North. And understanding why requires looking at some uncomfortable historical realities. Before the Civil War, the South didn't have large prison systems like the Northern states did. They didn't really need them. The institution of slavery already provided a mechanism for controlling a huge portion of the population. Enslaved people who violated rules were punished within that system, not sent to separate institutions. Prisons existed for white people who committed crimes, but they were relatively small. The Auburn system and the Pennsylvania system debates that shaped northern prisons just weren't as relevant in the South because the social structure was fundamentally different. Then the war ended. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. And suddenly, Southern states faced a major question. How do you maintain control and rebuild an economy that had been entirely dependent on forced labor when that labor system is now illegal? The answer they came up with was prison labor, but implemented in a way that was specifically designed to fill a very particular role. Southern states began passing laws known as black codes almost immediately after the war. These laws criminalized a wide range of behaviors, but they were enforced almost exclusively against formerly enslaved people. Vagrancy laws meant that if you didn't have a job or residence, you could be arrested. Loitering laws, laws against traveling without permits, laws that made it illegal to quit a job without your employer's permission. These weren't subtle. They were designed to create a legal framework for arresting black people and feeding them into a labor system. The result was predictable. Southern prisons suddenly filled with black men and women, arrested for minor infractions or sometimes for no real reason at all. And once they were convicted, they became available for labor. But unlike the northern prison labor system where prisoners worked in workshops inside prison walls, the South developed something called the convict lease system. And this is where things get particularly dark. Under convict leasing, states would lease prisoners to private companies or individuals. Coal mines, turpentine camps, lumber operations, railroads, plantations, anywhere that needed labor. The companies would pay the state a fee for each prisoner, and in exchange, they got workers who they could use however they saw fit. The prisoners were taken out of whatever minimal prison facility existed and transported to work sites where they labored under conditions that were often worse than anything that existed in northern prisons. The economic incentive structure here was even more perverse than what we saw with northern prison labor. States had a direct financial interest in arresting and convicting as many people as possible because each conviction represented revenue through leasing fees. Local sheriffs and judges were sometimes paid based on how many people they processed through the system. So you had law enforcement with a monetary reason to arrest people and a judicial system with a monetary reason to convict them. It was a recipe for mass incarceration driven purely by profit. The conditions in convict lease camps were brutal. Workers labored for long hours with minimal food and shelter. They were often worked until they collapsed. And because the companies leasing the prisoners had no long-term investment in keeping them healthy or alive, they had very little incentive to provide adequate care. If a prisoner died, the company could just lease another one. The mortality rates in some of these camps were staggering, though exact numbers are hard to come by because record keeping was intentionally poor. This wasn't hidden, by the way. People knew what was happening. Reformers and journalists wrote about the conditions in convict lease camps. They documented the deaths, the mistreatment, the obvious racial targeting of the system. But the practice continued because it was too profitable and because the people being exploited were former slaves who had very little political power or social standing. White society in the South, and to some extent northern businesses that also benefited from cheap Southern labor, had little incentive to change a system that worked so well for them. The convict lease system effectively created a new form of forced labor that replicated many aspects of slavery. Black people arrested on dubious charges, forced to work without compensation, subjected to harsh punishment, their labor enriching white landowners and business interests. The legal framework was different. You could argue it was technically following the law, at least as the law was written and enforced at the time. But the practical reality was a continuation of racial exploitation and control under a new name. Some southern states also used prison labor for public works projects, building roads, constructing levees, clearing land. Chain gangs became a common sight. Groups of prisoners literally chained together as they worked on roads and other infrastructure projects. This was presented as prisoners repaying their debt to society through useful work. But again, the racial composition of these chain gangs and the way the system was structured made it clear that this was about maintaining racial hierarchies as much as it was about justice or public benefit. The convict lease system persisted well into the 20th century in some states. Mississippi didn't officially end it until 1933. Alabama and other states held on nearly as long. And even when leasing formally ended, it was often replaced with state run labor systems that operated on similar principles. Parchman Farm in Mississippi, Angola in Louisiana, these became massive prison plantations where predominantly black inmates worked in agricultural labor under conditions that remained harsh and exploitative. It's important to note that this wasn't just a Southern problem, even though it was most extreme there. Northern prisons also used labor, as we've discussed. Northern states also had racial bias in their criminal justice systems. But the scale and the directness of the exploitation in the South, the way the system was explicitly designed to re-enslave a population that had just been freed, that was specific to the post-Civil War Southern context. It represented a direct response to emancipation, a way of maintaining white supremacy through legal mechanisms when slavery itself was no longer available. This history matters because it established patterns that would persist. The use of criminal justice systems to control black populations didn't end with convict leasing. It evolved, adapted, found new forms. Mass incarceration in the 20th and 21st centuries, the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, all of these have disproportionately affected black communities in ways that echo the convict lease system. The specifics change, but the underlying dynamic of using legal systems to control and exploit specific racial groups remains disturbingly consistent. So that's the Southern exception. Except it wasn't really an exception. It was an extreme version of dynamics that existed throughout American prisons. The linking of incarceration with economic exploitation, the targeting of vulnerable and marginalized populations, the gap between official rhetoric about justice and the reality of how systems actually operated. The South just did it more openly and more brutally in the decades following the Civil War, creating a prison labor system that served as a direct bridge between slavery and the mass incarceration we see today. Notorious early prisons. Now let's talk about some specific institutions that became symbols of everything dark about early American incarceration. We've already covered Eastern State and Auburn, but there were other prisons that gained notoriety, places whose names became synonymous with harsh punishment and rigid control. And perhaps no prison captured the public imagination quite like Sing Sing. Sing Sing Prison opened in 1826 in Ossining, New York, about 30 miles north of New York City on the Hudson River. And right from the start, it was designed to embody the Auburn system principles we talked about earlier. Individual cells for sleeping, congregate labor during the day, enforce silence at all times. But Sing Sing took these principles and implemented them with a level of strictness that made even other Auburn-style prisons seem lenient by comparison. The name itself is kind of interesting. Sing Sing comes from the Sink Sink Native American tribe that originally inhabited the area. But over time, the name became so associated with the prison that it entered American popular culture as shorthand for incarceration itself. People would say someone got sent up the river, meaning sent to Sing Sing up the Hudson. The prison became bigger than just an institution. It became a cultural reference point. What made Sing Sing particularly notorious was its reputation for harsh discipline. The guards there were known for strict enforcement of the silence rule. Any infraction could result in punishment, and the most common form of punishment was whipping, though officials preferred to call it other things in their reports. The prison used a leather strap that guards would apply to prisoners who broke rules. This happened frequently because the rules were extensive and rigidly enforced. The cell blocks at Sing Sing were designed for maximum capacity with minimum space. The original cells were tiny, about 7 feet long by 3 feet wide, with a ceiling maybe 7 feet high. Imagine a space barely big enough to lie down in. No windows, no ventilation beyond what came through the cell door. No toilet initially, just a bucket. Hundreds of men housed in these cramped spaces, spending about 14 hours a day locked inside before being marched out for labor and meals. During the day, prisoners at Sing Sing worked in various industries. The prison had workshops that produced goods ranging from furniture to shoes to carpets, but Sing Sing also had something else that made it unique: a marble quarry. The prison was actually built partially by prisoners using marble quarried from the site itself, and for decades after opening, prisoners continued working the quarry, extracting marble that was used in construction projects throughout New York and beyond. It was backbreaking labor, but at least it was outside. The marble quarry work was dangerous. Men worked with heavy tools and explosives. Accidents were common, but it was also considered preferable to working in the workshops because you got fresh air and sunlight. That tells you something about how oppressive the indoor conditions were. When prisoners considered dangerous quarry work an improvement, the baseline must have been pretty grim. Sing Sing gained particular notoriety for its death chamber. New York State started using the electric chair for executions in 1890, and Sing Sing became the primary execution site. The electric chair was presented as a humane alternative to hanging, though in practice, early electrocutions were often botched and horrific. But that's a whole other dark chapter. The point is that Sing Sing became associated not just with harsh incarceration, but with death itself. The prison also became known for housing high-profile criminals. As New York City grew and crime became more sophisticated, the most notorious criminals often ended up at Sing Sing. This raised the prison's profile in newspapers and public consciousness. People followed stories about famous inmates, about escape attempts, about riots and incidents. Sing Sing was news, which meant it was always under some level of public scrutiny, even as harsh conditions persisted inside. Interestingly, this notoriety eventually led to reforms. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the worst aspects of Sing Sing's regime began to be questioned publicly. Reformers pointed to the harsh discipline, the cramped cells, the silence rules that seemed designed more for control than rehabilitation. Some wardens who came in tried to implement more humane approaches, but change came slowly, and many of the core features of the prison remained in place for decades. Other prisons gained their own dark reputations during this period. The Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus became known for overcrowding and a massive fire in 1830 that killed prisoners who couldn't escape their locked cells. San Quentin in California, which opened in 1852, developed a reputation for violence and harsh conditions that persisted through multiple reform efforts. Each state had its showcase prison, and each one seemed to accumulate its own catalog of horrors. What these notorious prisons had in common was that they represented the logical conclusion of the early reform movement's ideas. They took the concepts of isolation, discipline, labor, and control and implemented them at scale. And in doing so, they revealed the fundamental problems with those concepts. You can't actually reform people through rigid discipline and harsh punishment. You can control them, you can break them, but you can't make them better. And the notorious prisons proved this over and over. Yet they persisted. Sing Sing operated for well over a century before finally being significantly reformed. Many of these early notorious prisons are still operating today in modified form. They became such entrenched parts of their state's criminal justice systems that closing them or fundamentally reimagining them was almost unthinkable. The institutions developed their own momentum, their own constituencies of guards and administrators and contractors who had an interest in keeping them running. The notoriety of places like Sing Sing also served a purpose for the broader system. They were examples. They were warnings. Everyone knew that serious criminals went to Sing Sing or San Quentin or other hard prisons. That reputation was part of the deterrent effect, at least in theory. The prisons were supposed to be places you absolutely did not want to end up, and their harsh reputations reinforced that message. But here's the thing about deterrence: it only works if people make rational calculations about the consequences of their actions. And most crime doesn't happen that way. People don't sit down and think, well, I might get sent to Sing Sing, so I better not do this. Crime is usually driven by poverty, desperation, addiction, mental illness, circumstances that override rational fear of punishment. So the notorious prisons and their harsh conditions probably didn't actually prevent much crime. They just made the punishment more severe for people who ended up there. These institutions also became training grounds for the American prison system. Guards who worked at Sing Sing or other notorious prisons would move on to work at other facilities, bringing their approaches and philosophies with them. Wardens would be recruited from successful hard prisons to run other institutions. The harsh discipline, the focus on control, the acceptance of violence as a management tool, all of this spread through the system because it was learned at places like Sing Sing. So when we talk about notorious early prisons, we're not just talking about individual bad institutions. We're talking about models that influenced the entire trajectory of American incarceration. Sing Sing and places like it showed that you could run large-scale prisons with rigid discipline and harsh conditions. They proved it was possible to maintain control over hundreds or thousands of prisoners with relatively small staff numbers if you were willing to be strict enough. And that lesson, for better or worse, shaped prison administration for generations. Reformers began to push back. So, by the mid to late 1800s, something interesting started happening. People who actually paid attention to what was going on inside prisons, people who visited regularly, people who studied the outcomes, they started noticing that the whole penitentiary experiment maybe wasn't working the way the original reformers had promised. And slowly, reluctantly, a new reform movement began to emerge. This time, the reformers weren't trying to create prisons. They were trying to fix what prisons had become. The first thing people started noticing was mental illness. And I don't mean they suddenly discovered that prisoners had mental health issues. As we discussed earlier, prisons had been warehousing mentally ill people from the beginning. But what reformers in the mid-1800s started documenting was that prison conditions themselves were causing mental breakdowns in people who had been relatively stable when they entered. The isolation, the silence, the rigid routine, the lack of meaningful human contact, all of it was breaking people psychologically. Doctors who visited prisons wrote reports about what they observed. Prisoners who talked to themselves constantly. Prisoners who became catatonic and unresponsive. Prisoners who developed paranoia or hallucinations. Prisoners who engaged in self-harm. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns that showed up across multiple institutions. And while prison officials often dismissed these observations as prisoners faking mental illness or as problems with the prisoners themselves rather than the system, outside observers were starting to connect the dots. One of the most influential voices in this period was Dorothea Dix, a social reformer who had already done extensive work documenting conditions in mental asylums. In the 1840s and 1850s, she turned her attention to prisons and found many of the same problems. People with mental illness receiving no appropriate care, people being driven to psychological crisis by prison conditions, and a system that had no idea how to respond except with more punishment. Dix lobbied state legislatures to create separate institutions for the mentally ill and to reform prison conditions. She had some success, though less than she hoped. Reformers also started noticing suicide rates. Prisons kept records, though not always reliable ones, and those records showed that prisoners were taking their own lives at disturbing rates. This was especially true in institutions that practiced extended solitary confinement. Eastern State Penitentiary, for all its claims about humane reform, had a serious problem with prisoners attempting or completing suicide. Other prisons using isolation reported similar issues. And while officials could explain away one or two cases, the pattern was undeniable. The thing about suicide in prisons is that it's hard to ignore completely. A prisoner who dies in their cell requires paperwork, investigations, sometimes public inquiries. Families ask questions. Newspapers occasionally write stories. So, unlike other forms of suffering that could be kept quiet, suicide forced some level of public acknowledgement that something was wrong. Reformers used these deaths to argue that prison conditions were not just harsh, but actively harmful in ways that went beyond what any punishment should entail. Then there was the issue of recidivism. This was perhaps the most damning evidence against the penitentiary system. The whole point, remember, was to reform criminals, turn them into penitent, moral citizens who would re enter society as productive members. But what actually happened was that many prisoners who were released ended up back in prison relatively quickly. They reoffended, got caught, and returned to the same institutions they'd just left. The system was supposed to be breaking the cycle of crime. Instead, it seemed to be reinforcing it. Some reformers started conducting actual studies, which was fairly novel at the time. They tracked prisoners after release and documented outcomes. What they found was not encouraging. High rates of recidivism, difficulty finding employment, social isolation, continued poverty. The skills prisoners supposedly learned through prison labor often didn't translate to real jobs on the outside. The moral reflection that was supposed to happen in solitary confinement either hadn't occurred or hadn't stuck. By any practical measure, prisons were failing at their stated goal of reform. This created a philosophical problem for the people who had championed the penitentiary system. They had spent decades arguing that isolation and discipline would transform criminals. They had built entire institutions based on this belief. They had convinced legislatures to fund these experiments. And now the evidence was mounting that it didn't work. Admitting this would mean acknowledging that the whole enterprise had been misguided from the start. So instead, many doubled down. Maybe the system was fine, they argued. Maybe the prisoners just weren't trying hard enough. Maybe the problem was that society wasn't supporting released prisoners adequately. But a growing number of reformers weren't buying these excuses. They looked at the mental illness, the suicides, the recidivism, and concluded that the fundamental approach was flawed. Isolating people doesn't reform them, it damages them. Enforcing silence doesn't lead to moral reflection, it causes psychological harm. Rigid discipline doesn't teach self-control. It teaches people to be good at following rules in prison, which is not the same as being able to navigate life outside. These reformers started advocating for different approaches. Some pushed for education programs in prisons, actual schooling rather than just labor. Some advocated for more contact with family members, arguing that maintaining social connections was crucial for successful reintegration. Some called for shorter sentences and more lenient conditions. Some even suggested that maybe, just maybe, locking people up for years wasn't the answer to every social problem. The pushback from reformers also highlighted the gap between the official philosophy of prisons and the actual practice. Prison officials still talked about rehabilitation and moral improvement. Annual reports to legislatures praised the reformative effects of the penitentiary system. But reformers who actually spent time in prisons saw the reality. They saw the brutality, the exploitation, the focus on labor and profit over genuine reform. They documented the disconnect between rhetoric and reality. One area where reformers made some headway was with juvenile offenders. The idea that children shouldn't be in the same institutions as adult criminals gained traction in the mid to late 1800s. This led to the creation of separate reform schools and houses of refuge for juveniles. These institutions had their own problems, and many were barely better than regular prisons, but at least the principle was established that children needed different treatment. It was a small victory for the reform movement. Reformers also began questioning the entire economic structure of prison labor. Labor unions, as mentioned earlier, had their own reasons for opposing prison made goods competing with free labor. But some reformers criticized the system from a moral standpoint. They argued that using prisoners as cheap labor wasn't rehabilitative, it was exploitative. It turned people into commodities. It created incentives for states to keep prisons full and sentences long. These arguments didn't end prison labor, but they did start a conversation about what purpose it actually served. Religious groups played a significant role in the reform pushback. Many of the same Quaker and other religious organizations that had supported the original penitentiary concept now looked at what their ideas had produced and were troubled. They had genuinely believed in redemption and moral transformation. Seeing the reality of how prisons operated, the suffering they caused, the failure to actually reform people, some religious reformers became critics of the very system they had helped create. The reform movement in the late 1800s didn't fundamentally transform prisons. The basic structure remained. Auburn-style institutions continued to dominate. Prison labor continued. Harsh conditions persisted in most facilities. But what the reformers did accomplish was planting seeds of doubt about the entire enterprise. They documented the failures. They gave voice to the suffering. They challenged the assumption that isolation and punishment naturally led to reform. And they created a foundation for future reform efforts, even if those efforts would take decades or longer to bear fruit. What's striking is how long it took for these criticisms to gain traction. The evidence that the penitentiary system wasn't working was available fairly early. Mental illness, suicide, recidivism, all of this was documented by the mid 1800s, but the system persisted largely unchanged for decades after that, because institutions are hard to change once they're established. Too many people have invested too much in the current approach. Too much infrastructure exists. Too many jobs depend on things staying the same. So even when reformers make compelling arguments backed by evidence, change happens slowly, if it happens at all. The late 1800s reform movement also revealed something important about American attitudes toward punishment. There was, and still is, a tension between wanting to help people change and wanting to see them suffer for their crimes. The original penitentiary reformers thought they could do both. Punishment through isolation would lead to moral improvement. But what actually happened was that the punishment overshadowed any possibility of improvement. And when reformers pointed this out, they often faced resistance from a public that wasn't ready to let go of the idea that criminals needed to suffer. So that's where things stood as the 1800s drew to a close. A prison system built on flawed assumptions about human nature, generating significant suffering and failing to achieve its stated goals, being criticized by a growing reform movement that nonetheless struggled to create meaningful change. The stage was set for the 20th century, which would bring new problems, new approaches, and new failures. But before we get there, we need to step back and look at what America learned, or failed to learn, from its first experiments with mass incarceration. What America learned too late. All right, so here we are at the end of our journey through early American prisons, and we need to talk about what all of this meant. What lessons did America learn from its first experiments with long-term incarceration? And perhaps more importantly, what lessons did it fail to learn even when the evidence was staring everyone in the face? The first and most important lesson should have been this: you cannot build a system based purely on theory and hope it works. The penitentiary movement was launched by well-meaning reformers who had ideas about human nature, moral improvement, and the transformative power of isolation. But these were just ideas. They hadn't been tested. There was no evidence that solitary confinement led to moral reflection rather than psychological breakdown. There was no proof that silence encouraged penitence rather than despair. The entire experiment was theoretical. And yet, based on these untested theories, America built hundreds of prisons. States invested millions of dollars in infrastructure. Thousands of people were subjected to conditions designed to implement these philosophical concepts. The system scaled nationally before anyone really understood the consequences. It's like deciding to manufacture a new drug and distributing it to millions of people before conducting any clinical trials. You wouldn't do that with medicine. But apparently, it was fine to do with human beings and criminal justice. By the time the problems became undeniable, it was too late to simply stop. The prisons existed, they were full of people, states had built entire systems around them. Backing out would have meant admitting a massive mistake and figuring out what to do with all those prisoners and all that infrastructure. So instead of fundamentally rethinking the approach, officials tweaked around the edges. Maybe less isolation, maybe more labor, maybe different rules. But the basic structure remained because dismantling it would have been too complicated. This pattern of scaling before understanding consequences would repeat throughout American criminal justice history. Mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, the war on drugs, all of these were implemented broadly before anyone fully understood their effects, and all of them created problems that became apparent only after the policies were deeply entrenched. The early prison experiment should have taught America to be more cautious, to test approaches on a smaller scale, to gather evidence before committing to massive systemic changes. But that lesson was never really learned. The second major lesson should have been about the gap between stated goals and actual outcomes. The penitentiary system claimed to be about rehabilitation and moral reform. That was the sales pitch. That was how reformers convinced legislatures to fund these institutions. But in practice, the system quickly became about control and economic exploitation. Prison labor generated revenue, harsh discipline maintained order. The reform rhetoric remained, but the reality was something else entirely. This disconnect between official purpose and actual function is a hallmark of American criminal justice. We say prisons are about rehabilitation, but we operate them in ways that make rehabilitation nearly impossible. We claim to want to reduce recidivism, but we create conditions that increase it. We talk about dignity and human rights, but we tolerate practices that violate both. The early prison system established this pattern of saying one thing while doing another, and it's been remarkably persistent. What's frustrating is that the evidence of this disconnect was available relatively early. Reformers documented it, journalists wrote about it, prisoners themselves testified to it when anyone bothered to listen. But the system persisted because the people running it had reasons to maintain the fiction. Admitting that prisons were primarily about control and profit rather than reform would have undermined public support. So the rhetoric continued even as the reality diverged further and further from the stated ideals. The third lesson involves who ends up in prison and why. As we discussed, early prisons filled disproportionately with the poor, immigrants, and the mentally ill. This wasn't an accident. It was a feature of how the system was designed and operated. Laws were written in ways that criminalized poverty. Enforcement focused on vulnerable populations. Judicial discretion was applied unevenly. And prisons became warehouses for people society didn't know what to do with or didn't want to deal with. This should have prompted a serious conversation about what prisons are really for. Are they about punishing crime, or are they about managing populations that make society uncomfortable? Are they addressing harmful behavior, or are they hiding social problems we don't want to solve properly? But that conversation didn't really happen. at least not in any meaningful way that led to systemic change. Instead, the pattern continued. Throughout American history, prison populations have reflected who society wants to control or exclude rather than who has necessarily committed the most harmful acts. The racial dynamics in the South after the Civil War should have been an especially loud alarm bell. The convict lease system was so obviously about racial control and economic exploitation that it should have prompted a national reckoning with how criminal justice could be weaponized against specific populations. But instead, it was largely ignored outside the South or justified as a regional issue. And the underlying pattern of using criminal justice for racial control continued in different forms throughout the 20th century and into the present. Another lesson that should have been learned involves the economics of incarceration. Once prison labor became profitable, once states realized they could offset costs or even generate revenue through prisoner work, the incentives changed. Suddenly, there were economic reasons to keep prisons full, financial motivations to extend sentences, pressure to maintain a steady supply of workers. The original reform goal of reducing crime and helping people change got overshadowed by the practical reality that prisoners were valuable economic assets. This created a perverse situation where the system had an interest in its own failure. If prisons actually reformed people and reduced recidivism, the labor pool would shrink. If sentences were too short, you couldn't fully exploit workers before releasing them. The economic logic pointed toward keeping people locked up longer and ensuring a steady stream of new prisoners. And while officials would never state this explicitly, the incentive structure pushed in that direction regardless of intentions. America should have learned that you can't make criminal justice self-funding without corrupting its purposes. You can't turn punishment into a profit center without creating terrible incentives. But this lesson wasn't learned either. Prison labor continued, evolved, found new forms, and in the late 20th century, private prisons would emerge as the next iteration of the same basic problem, treating incarceration as a business opportunity rather than a social necessity. The treatment of mental illness in early prisons should have taught America that criminal justice is not an appropriate response to health problems. Prisons made mentally ill people worse. They didn't provide treatment. They provided isolation and punishment, which exacerbated existing conditions and created new problems. This should have led to investment in mental health infrastructure, in community support systems, in alternatives to incarceration for people experiencing psychiatric crises. Some of that happened, but not nearly enough. And today, jails and prisons remain de facto mental health institutions, just as they were in the 1800s. Perhaps the most fundamental lesson that went unlearned is this: isolation and punishment do not transform people for the better. They might control behavior temporarily. They might make people compliant within the prison environment, but they don't address the underlying issues that lead to criminal behavior. They don't build skills or connections or support systems that would help someone succeed outside prison. And in many cases, they cause active harm that makes successful reintegration less likely. The early reformers genuinely believed that putting someone in a cell and giving them time to reflect would lead to moral transformation. They were wrong. Decades of evidence proved they were wrong. But the fundamental approach of using isolation as a primary tool of incarceration persisted anyway. Solitary confinement is still used widely in American prisons today. We've known for over a century that it causes psychological damage. We know it doesn't improve outcomes. But we keep doing it because the alternative would require rethinking how we approach incarceration more broadly. So what did America actually learn from its first prison experiments? Not much, honestly. The problems identified in the 1800s, mental illness, exploitation, recidivism, disproportionate impact on vulnerable populations, these all persist today. The critiques made by 19th century reformers could be applied to contemporary prisons with minimal modification. We've known what doesn't work for a very long time. We've had evidence of the failures for generations, but the system keeps operating largely as it has for over a century. Why? Partly it's institutional inertia. Systems resist change. People invested in the current approach resist change. Change is expensive and politically difficult. But partly it's because the stated goals of prisons, rehabilitation, and public safety have never really been the only or even primary goals. Prisons also serve functions of social control, economic exploitation, and political signaling. And for those purposes, the current system works fine. It does what it's actually designed to do, regardless of what we say it's designed to do. The history of early American prisons is a history of good intentions producing harmful outcomes, of rhetoric diverging from reality, of problems identified but not addressed, of lessons available but not learned. It's a history that should inform contemporary debates about criminal justice reform, because many of the issues we're grappling with now, mass incarceration, racial disparities, the failure of rehabilitation, the role of profit in punishment, these all have roots in those first experiments with penitentiaries in the late 1700s and early 1800s. We're still, in many ways, living with the consequences of decisions made 200 years ago, still operating prisons based on philosophies that were proven inadequate generations ago, still subjecting people to conditions that we've known for over a century cause more harm than good. The early history of American prisons is not just historical curiosity, it's the foundation of the system we have today. And until we actually learn the lessons that history tried to teach us, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes in new forms. So that's the story. From colonial punishment through the first penitentiaries, from the Pennsylvania system to Auburn, from prison labor to convict leasing, from the notorious hard prisons to the reform movements that tried to fix what was broken. It's a story of ambition and failure, of cruelty masked as progress, of systems built on untested theories that became too entrenched to dismantle, even when they proved harmful. It's dark history, uncomfortable history, but it's history we need to understand if we want to build something better, because the alternative is continuing to repeat it over and over while telling ourselves that this time will be different. And that's the darkest outcome of all. And that brings us to the end of this particular journey through the shadows of American history. So the next time you think about prisons, about justice, about punishment and reform, remember where it all started. Remember the Quakers who thought isolation would lead to redemption. Remember the Auburn system that chose efficiency over humanity. Remember the convict lease camps in the South. Remember all the people whose suffering was justified by philosophies that sounded noble, but produced something much darker. America's first prisons were built with hope, discipline, and certainty. What they produced instead was a lesson still being learned, slowly, reluctantly, 2 centuries later. Sleep well tonight. And maybe, just maybe, think about what it means that we're still operating systems based on ideas proven wrong before your great-great-grandparents were born. Sweet dreams.